Imagine you were living a completely normal life until one day a single whispered curse turned your entire world into a living nightmare. Picture this. You're one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in Louisiana, ruling over vast plantations, controlling thousands of lives, believing yourself untouchable. Then, without warning, everything you've built begins to crumble. Your sons start dying in ways that defy explanation. Your fortune evaporates like morning mist. Your name becomes a warning whispered in the shadows. And at the center of it all stands one woman, a figure so mysterious, so feared, that even today her name makes people cross themselves and look over their shoulders. New Orleans, Louisiana, 1834. The Trem district pulses with life, but beneath the music and laughter, something ancient stirs. Marie Laveau walks through the narrow streets like she owns them, and in many ways, she does. Not through money or title, but through something far more powerful: fear, respect, and magic that runs deeper than the Mississippi River itself. What the wealthy Creole families don't understand yet is that their reign of terror is about to end, and it will end at the hands of a woman they dismissed as nothing more than a superstitious healer. Before we dive deeper into this incredible true story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one are exactly what we bring you every single week. The morning air hung thick and heavy over the French Quarter, carrying with it the scent of jasmine, coffee, and something else. Something that made even the boldest men quicken their step when they passed certain doorways. It was the smell of power, ancient and undeniable, rising from a small cottage on St. Anne Street, where Marie Laveau prepared for what would become the most legendary confrontation in Louisiana history. She wasn't born to power. Marie Catherine Laveau came into this world in 1801, the daughter of a freed woman of color and a white planter who never acknowledged her existence. But bloodlines don't determine destiny, and Marie would prove that truth in ways that would shake the very foundations of New Orleans society. She learned early that in a world designed to crush people like her, survival meant more than just enduring. It meant mastering forces that others feared to even whisper about. The Voodoo Queen, they called her, though she preferred the title of priestess. In the shadowed courtyards of the French Quarter, in the secret gatherings deep in the bayou, Marie Laveau commanded respect from people of every color and class. Slaves whispered her name like a prayer. Free people of color sought her counsel like wisdom from on high. And even the proudest Creole families, the ones who publicly scorned her kind, secretly sent their wives and daughters to her door when conventional medicine and prayer failed them. But on this particular morning in 1834, Marie wasn't thinking about healing. She was thinking about judgment, about a family whose cruelty had finally pushed her beyond the boundaries of mercy. The Beauregard dynasty had ruled over their sugar plantation empire with an iron fist for 3 generations, treating human beings like livestock, crushing spirits with the same casual indifference they showed when swatting mosquitoes. Their latest atrocity had crossed a line that even Marie's patient heart could not forgive. 2 days earlier, they had taken a child. Not sold, not transferred, taken. A 7-year-old girl named Celeste, whose only crime was being born with skin too light and eyes too bright. The Beauregards claimed she was actually the master's daughter, born of a liaison with one of their house servants. Whether true or not didn't matter to them. What mattered was removing the evidence, silencing the whispers, maintaining their precious reputation. So they loaded little Celeste onto a wagon bound for the slave markets of Natchez, where children disappeared into the cotton fields like stones dropped into dark water. But they had made one critical error. Celeste's grandmother was Marie's closest friend, a woman named Ursulie, who had taught Marie some of her most potent secrets. When Ursulie came to Marie's cottage that morning, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, Marie knew that the time for patience had ended. The spirits had been calling for justice, and the Beauregards had just provided the perfect reason to answer that call. Marie moved through her preparations with the methodical precision of a surgeon. She gathered her tools from their sacred places, the bone needles carved from cemetery dirt, the red silk threads blessed under 13 full moons, the oils pressed from roots that grew only in the deepest swamp. Each item carried power accumulated over years of careful ritual. Years of building relationships with forces that most people couldn't even imagine. The doll came together slowly, deliberately. Not the crude puppet of popular imagination, but a work of art that would have impressed any craftsman. Marie shaped the wax with her own hands, warming it with her breath, infusing it with intention that ran deeper than hatred. This wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. This was about balance. The scales of justice had been tilted for too long, and Marie Laveau was about to set them right. As she worked, she spoke. Not to herself, but to the spirits that gathered whenever she called. They came like smoke through the floorboards, like whispers through the walls. Ancestral voices that remembered the old ways, the old powers, the old promises. They had been waiting for someone strong enough, someone bold enough, someone desperate enough to invoke the kind of working that Marie was preparing. And they were hungry for what was about to unfold. The Beauregard family had no idea what was coming. Auguste Beauregard sat in his mahogany-paneled study that morning, reviewing ledgers that reduced human lives to columns of profit and loss. His eldest son, Philippe, was in the fields, cracking his whip with the enthusiasm of a man who had never felt its bite on his own back. The younger son, Lucien, lounged on the veranda, already drunk despite the early hour, boasting to visiting friends about the fortune they would inherit. None of them felt the shadow that had just fallen across their bloodline. None of them sensed the shift in the spiritual atmosphere around their grand plantation house. They were too drunk on their own power, too intoxicated by their sense of invincibility, to notice that the very air around them had begun to change. The birds stopped singing in their gardens. The dogs whined and pressed close to the ground. Even the Spanish moss hanging from their ancient oaks seemed to tremble without any wind to move it. But in the slave quarters, people knew. They felt it in their bones, in their blood, in the collective memory that connects all who have suffered under the same yoke. Something was shifting, something was coming, and for the first time in generations, it wasn't coming for them. It was coming for the ones who had made their lives a living hell. Marie completed her work as the sun reached its peak. The doll lay before her, perfect in its terrible purpose, waiting for the final words that would bind the curse and set it loose upon the world. She had spent hours crafting not just the physical form, but the spiritual architecture that would carry her working across the miles to the Beauregard plantation. Every thread, every drop of wax, every whispered word had been placed with the precision of a master architect building a cathedral. But this cathedral was built for destruction, not worship. She held the doll in her palms, feeling its weight, its potential, its terrible promise. The wax was still warm from her touch, but something else warmed it now, something that pulsed with its own heartbeat, its own hunger, its own unbreakable will. Marie closed her eyes and let the words flow through her. Words in languages that predated the ships, predated the chains, predated the lie that some people could own other people. The curse left her lips like smoke, like fire, like the whisper of wind through cemetery gates. It wrapped around the doll, sank into its wax flesh, took root in its carefully crafted form. And then it was gone, racing across the miles toward its target with the speed of lightning, the inevitability of death, the patience of the grave. At the Beauregard plantation, Philippe felt it first. He was standing in the cane fields, watching his overseers drive the workers harder, when a chill ran down his spine despite the blazing Louisiana sun. He turned, expecting to see storm clouds, but the sky was clear as crystal. The sensation passed, and he dismissed it as nothing more than a moment's discomfort. But something had changed in that instant, something fundamental and irreversible. That night, Philippe couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his four-poster bed, sheets soaked with sweat, despite the cool evening breeze flowing through his windows. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces. The faces of people he had hurt, people he had broken, people whose names he had never bothered to learn. They stared at him with eyes full of accusation, full of pain, full of something that looked suspiciously like pity. By morning, the fever had him. It came on fast and brutal, burning through his body like wildfire through dry grass. The plantation's physician was summoned, then another, then a specialist brought all the way from New Orleans. None of them could explain it. His temperature soared beyond anything they had seen, yet he shivered as if trapped in winter ice. His skin grew pale as parchment, then flushed red as blood, then took on a waxy yellow tinge that reminded everyone who saw it of something unnatural. Auguste Beauregard paced the halls of his mansion like a caged animal. His eldest son, his heir, his pride and joy, was dying before his eyes, and no amount of money or influence could stop it. He sent riders to every corner of Louisiana, seeking doctors, healers, anyone who might have answers. But deep in his heart, in a place he refused to acknowledge even to himself, he knew this was no ordinary sickness. Lucien tried to maintain his usual swagger, but fear had taken root in his chest like a cancer. He drank more heavily than ever, surrounding himself with friends and sycophants who laughed too loud at his jokes and agreed too quickly with his every word. But even drunk, even surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something patient and hungry and absolutely certain of its purpose. The slaves whispered among themselves, but their whispers carried a different tone now. Not the desperate hope of the oppressed, but something closer to awe. Word had somehow reached them that Marie Laveau had taken an interest in their situation. They didn't know exactly what she had done, but they could feel the change in the air, the shift in the spiritual weather around the plantation. For the first time in their lives, they allowed themselves to believe that justice might actually exist. Philippe lasted 3 days. On the final night, as his fever reached its peak, he began speaking in voices that weren't his own. Languages he had never learned flowed from his lips in torrents. He spoke of pain and suffering, of children torn from their mothers' arms, of backs broken by whips and spirits crushed by cruelty. The family physician fled the room in terror. The priest who had been called to administer last rites crossed himself repeatedly and muttered prayers in Latin that seemed to have no effect whatsoever. When Philippe finally died, it was with a scream that echoed through every corner of the plantation house. But it wasn't his voice that screamed. It was the collective voice of every person he had ever harmed, every life he had destroyed, every dream he had crushed beneath his boot. The sound shattered windows throughout the mansion and sent every bird within miles fleeing toward the horizon. Auguste buried his son in the family cemetery with all the pomp and ceremony that money could buy. But even as the priest spoke words of comfort and eternal rest, everyone present could feel that Philippe's spirit had found no peace. The very ground above his grave seemed restless, shifting and settling in ways that made the mourners step back and cross themselves. Before the funeral guests had even departed, the curse began claiming its second victim. Lucien woke that morning to find his reflection missing from every mirror in the house. He could see everything else clearly, the room behind him, the furniture, the light streaming through the windows. But where his own face should have been, there was nothing but empty space, as if he had already begun to fade from existence. The phenomenon spread beyond mirrors. Photographs of Lucien began to blur and fade, no matter how carefully they were preserved. Paintings commissioned to capture his likeness developed strange distortions, his features melting and running like wax in the sun. Even his own shadow seemed reluctant to follow him, lagging behind or disappearing entirely during certain hours of the day. Panic consumed the Beauregard household. Servants fled in the night, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs. Those who remained moved through the mansion like ghosts themselves, speaking in whispers, jumping at every sound, crossing themselves whenever they passed the portraits of the family patriarchs that now seemed to watch them with accusing eyes. Auguste threw money at the problem with the desperation of a drowning man. He hired investigators, consulted with scholars, even secretly approached practitioners of the very arts he had always publicly scorned. But every door he tried to open led to the same conclusion, the same name whispered with the same mixture of fear and respect. Marie Laveau had set something in motion that no earthly power could stop. The Voodoo Queen herself remained in her cottage on St. Anne Street, tending to her regular clients, preparing her remedies, conducting her rituals with the same calm precision she had always shown. To those who knew how to read the signs, however, her satisfaction was evident. Justice was being served, slowly and thoroughly, exactly as it should be. But the curse Marie had crafted was far from finished. Philippe's death and Lucien's spiritual erasure were merely the opening notes of a symphony of retribution that would play out over months, perhaps years, The Beauregard dynasty had built their power on the suffering of others, and now they would learn exactly what that suffering felt like. The plantation fields grew silent in ways that defied nature. No insects buzzed among the cane stalks. No birds sang from the ancient oaks. Even the wind seemed afraid to whisper through the leaves. Auguste Beauregard stood at his study window, watching his empire crumble one inexplicable disaster at a time, and for the first time in his life, the master of thousands felt utterly powerless. Lucien's condition worsened with each passing day. The young man who had once strutted through New Orleans society like he owned the very cobblestones, now cowered in his room, terrified of his own reflection, or rather, the complete absence of it. Servants reported hearing him talking to empty mirrors, pleading with someone or something to give him back his face, his identity, his very existence. But Marie Laveau wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The curse she had woven was like a living thing, growing stronger as it fed on the family's fear, their desperation, their dawning realization that their wealth and status meant nothing against forces older than civilization itself. Each thread of the working was connected to the next, creating a web of retribution that would ensnare every member of the Beauregard bloodline. Word of the family's troubles spread through New Orleans like fever through a crowded ward. In the coffee houses of the French Quarter, men who had once fawned over Auguste's friendship now whispered behind their hands. In the drawing rooms of the Garden District, ladies who had competed for invitations to Beauregard's soirée now crossed themselves and changed the subject when the family name was mentioned. Fear has a way of making people remember their consciences, and suddenly everyone recalled the cruelties they had chosen to overlook when it was profitable to do so. Auguste tried everything money could buy. He brought in doctors from Paris, priests from Rome, even a professor of the occult from Harvard University who claimed to specialize in supernatural phenomena. Each expert arrived with confidence and left with terror etched into their features. The Harvard professor lasted exactly 3 hours in the mansion before fleeing in the middle of the night, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note that read, "Some doors should never be opened. Yours has been kicked off its hinges." If you're enjoying this incredible true story of supernatural justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most fascinating tales of mystery, history, and the unexplained every single week. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. As autumn deepened into winter, the curse began manifesting in ways that defied all logic. The mansion's grand staircase started bleeding. Not paint, not rust, not any substance that could be identified or cleaned away. Real blood that seeped through the marble steps, pooled on the landing, and filled the air with the metallic scent of violence. Servants refused to climb those stairs after dark, claiming they could hear footsteps that belonged to the sugar mill ground to a halt when workers discovered that to people who were no longer alive. The plantation, the machinery had somehow twisted itself into shapes that resembled instruments of torture. Gears had fused into the form of shackles. Drive belts had configured themselves into nooses. The massive grinding stones bore impressions that looked disturbingly like human faces, mouths open in eternal screams. Lucien's fading accelerated. Photographs of him now showed only empty clothing, as if he had simply evaporated while posing. His voice grew fainter each day, his physical presence becoming so translucent that people could see through him to the furniture behind. He begged his father to help him, but Auguste was fighting his own battle against the curse's relentless advance. The family patriarch found himself plagued by visions that came whether he was awake or asleep. He saw the faces of every slave who had died under his authority, every child who had been sold away from their parents, every man and woman who had been worked to death in his fields. They didn't speak to him, didn't threaten or accuse. They simply stared with eyes that held the weight of centuries of suffering, and their silence was more terrifying than any scream. Marie Laveau continued her work in the French Quarter, but now her cottage had become a pilgrimage site for people seeking protection from the Beauregard curse. They came bearing offerings, stories, prayers for justice that had been denied them by earthly courts. Marie accepted them all with the same serene grace, adding their pain to the working she had set in motion, feeding the spell with every new testimony of the family's cruelty. The economic impact of the curse spread beyond the plantation itself. Ships refused to dock at the Beauregard warehouses, claiming their cargo spoiled the moment it touched the family's property. Banks began calling in loans, suddenly nervous about their association with a name that had become synonymous with supernatural retribution. Insurance companies cancelled policies, citing acts of God clauses that they stretched to cover acts of voodoo. Auguste's health began to fail as winter turned to spring. Not the dramatic fever that had claimed Philippe, but a slow, grinding deterioration that seemed to age him years in the span of weeks. His hair went white overnight. His hands developed a tremor that made him spill his morning coffee. His eyes took on a haunted quality that made even his most loyal servants uncomfortable. But the most disturbing change was in his dreams. Every night, Auguste found himself transported to a courtroom that existed in no earthly realm. The judge wore robes that shifted like smoke, and the jury consisted entirely of people he had wronged. They presented evidence of his crimes with methodical precision, reading from ledgers written in blood, displaying photographs that showed the true cost of his prosperity. The verdict was always the same: guilty on all counts. The sentence was always the same: everything you have built will crumble, everyone you love will suffer, and your name will become a curse upon the lips of those who remember. By summer, Lucien had faded to the point where only his voice remained, a disembodied whisper that floated through the mansion's halls like a ghost already dead. He begged for release, for forgiveness, for an end to the torment. But his pleas fell on deaf ears, both earthly and supernatural. The curse would run its course according to Marie's design, and no amount of suffering would satisfy it until justice had been fully served. Auguste made one final, desperate attempt to break the spell. He travelled to Marie's cottage himself, something no man of his standing had ever done. He arrived in the middle of the night, alone, carrying a satchel filled with everything he thought might buy his family's freedom: gold coins, precious jewels, deeds to property, even the papers that would legally free every slave on his plantation. Marie received him in her garden, surrounded by plants that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. She listened to his offer without expression, her dark eyes reflecting the flames of the candles that burned despite the summer heat. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for so long that Auguste began to wonder if she had heard him at all. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of ancestral wisdom and implacable judgment. "Monsieur Beauregard," she said, "you offer me gold to undo what your cruelty has wrought. But tell me, what gold did you offer little Celeste when you sold her into hell? What jewels did you give to her grandmother when you tore that child from her arms? What property deeds did you sign to compensate the mothers whose babies you worked to death in your fields?" Auguste opened his mouth to respond, but Marie held up a hand that silenced him more effectively than a shout. "The curse I have placed upon your bloodline is not one of revenge, monsieur. It is one of balance. For generations, your family has tipped the scales of justice so far in your favor that the weight of suffering on the other side has become unbearable. What you experience now is simply the universe correcting itself." She stepped closer, and Auguste felt power radiating from her like heat from a forge. "Your son Philippe died as my people have died, in agony and terror. Your son Lucien fades as my people have faded, erased from history by those who refuse to see their humanity. And you, Auguste Beauregard, will lose everything as my people have lost everything, piece by piece, until you understand what it means to have nothing left but the hope that someone, somewhere, might remember your name with kindness." Marie turned away, dismissing him with a gesture that carried more finality than any words could convey. Auguste stumbled back to his carriage, knowing with absolute certainty that he had just sealed his family's fate. The curse would continue, relentless and unstoppable, until the Beauregard dynasty was nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of New Orleans. But Marie Laveau's working was about to reveal its most terrifying aspect yet. What Auguste didn't understand, what none of the Beauregards had realized, was that the curse was not just destroying their present. It was unraveling their past, erasing their legacy from history itself, ensuring that their name would survive only as a warning about the price of cruelty. The true horror was just beginning. The curse began eating through time itself like acid through silk. Auguste returned from Marie's cottage to find that portraits of his ancestors had begun changing overnight. Family paintings that had hung in the mansion for generations now showed empty frames, the Beauregard patriarchs slowly dissolving from the canvas as if they had never existed. The family Bible, kept in a glass case for over a century, watched its pages turn blank one by one, erasing births, marriages, deaths, the entire lineage fading into nothingness. But this was only the beginning of Marie's most devastating working. The curse wasn't content to simply destroy the present Beauregards. It was reaching backward through time, unmaking their very existence, ensuring that their wealth, their power, their entire dynasty would be remembered only as a fever dream that New Orleans society was slowly waking up from. The plantation records began disappearing from government offices throughout Louisiana. Deeds vanished from courthouse files. Bank records showed accounts that had never been opened. Ships' manifests no longer listed cargo bound for Beauregard warehouses. It was as if the universe itself was editing the family out of existence, one document at a time. Lucien's voice grew weaker each day until it was nothing more than a whisper that servants claimed to hear in empty rooms. He would call out for his father, for his dead brother, for anyone who might remember that he had once been real, but even his own reflection in puddles of water refused to acknowledge his presence. The young man who had once commanded attention at every social gathering was becoming less real with each passing hour. Auguste watched his empire crumble with the helpless horror of a man trapped in quicksand. His business partners claimed they had never heard of him. His bankers insisted they had no record of his accounts. Former friends passed him on the street without recognition, their eyes sliding over him as if he were invisible. The curse was teaching him exactly what it felt like to be treated as less than human, to have your very existence denied by those in power. The mansion itself began to rebel. Doors locked themselves and refused to open, trapping Auguste in rooms that grew smaller each day. Windows showed scenes from the past instead of the present landscape. Mirrors reflected not his face, but the faces of every slave who had died under his authority. The house was becoming a prison of memory, forcing him to confront the true cost of his prosperity. Marie Laveau continued her work with the methodical patience of someone who understood that true justice could not be rushed. She tended to her garden, prepared her remedies, received visitors who came seeking healing and hope. But every night she returned to the doll that sat on her altar, adding new elements to the curse, strengthening the working that was systematically dismantling everything the Beauregards had built. The supernatural destruction spread beyond the family itself. The sugarcane in their fields withered despite perfect growing conditions. The soil turned bitter and refused to support any crop. Wells that had provided sweet water for decades suddenly ran dry or produced liquid that tasted of blood and tears. Even the ancient oak trees that had shaded the plantation for centuries began dying from their roots up, as if the very earth rejected the Beauregard presence. By autumn, Lucien had faded completely. His room stood empty, but servants still heard his voice calling out in the darkness, pleading for someone to remember him. His clothes hung in wardrobes that no longer knew their owner. His books sat on shelves, but the name written inside their covers had vanished, leaving only blank spaces where his identity should have been. Auguste aged 10 years in 10 weeks. His hair fell out in clumps. His teeth loosened and dropped from his mouth like leaves in winter. His skin took on the waxy, translucent quality of old parchment. But the most disturbing change was in his mind. He began forgetting his own history, his own identity, as the curse worked its way through his memories like termites through old wood. The curse reached its crescendo on Halloween night, 1835. Auguste woke to find himself completely alone in the mansion. Every servant had vanished. Every piece of furniture had disappeared. Even his own clothes had faded away, leaving him naked and shivering in rooms that no longer seemed to belong to him. The walls showed no paintings, no decorations, nothing to indicate that anyone had ever lived there. He stumbled through the empty halls, calling out names he could barely remember. Philippe, Lucien, his wife, who had died years earlier. Anyone who might prove that his life had been real. But only echoes answered him, and even those sounded hollow and uncertain, as if the house itself doubted his existence. In the study, where he had once planned the destruction of so many lives, Auguste found a single item remaining, a mirror, cracked and tarnished, that showed not his reflection, but the face of little Celeste, the child whose abduction had triggered Marie's terrible working. She looked at him with eyes full of sadness and something that might have been pity. "You forgot my name," she whispered from within the glass, "just like you forgot all of our names." But Marie remembered. Marie always remembers. Auguste Beauregard died that night, alone and forgotten, his body dissolving into mist like his legacy had dissolved into nothing. The mansion stood empty for exactly 1 year before nature reclaimed it completely. Vines swallowed the walls, roots cracked the foundation, and Spanish moss draped the ruins like a burial shroud. By 1840, even the locals had forgotten a plantation ever stood there at all. Marie Laveau lived for another 46 years, becoming the most powerful woman in New Orleans, feared and revered in equal measure. She never spoke of the Beauregard curse publicly, but those who knew how to listen could hear the lesson in every story she told. Justice delayed is not justice denied, especially when it comes wrapped in wax and sealed with words that predate memory itself. Today, if you walk through the French Quarter on certain nights when the moon is dark and the air hangs heavy with secrets, old-timers say you can still feel her presence, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that some powers are older than law, deeper than hatred, and more patient than death. The Beauregard name appears in no history books, on no monuments, in no records of Louisiana's past. They have been edited out of existence so thoroughly that even mentioning them feels like speaking a language that was never meant for human tongues. But Marie's name endures, carved into the very soul of New Orleans, like scripture written in stone, because she understood something that the powerful always forget, something that echoes through every curse she ever cast and every blessing she ever gave. The universe keeps its own books, and eventually, every debt comes due. The scales of justice don't rust, they don't break, and they never, ever forget. They simply wait for the right hands to tip them back where they belong.